Adam, you and I have known each other for a very long time. I would say very long time, 30 years at least, I think.
Yeah.
David, we have not met before, but it's such a pleasure to meet you. I've been such an admirer of your work for a long time. And it was so great for me to see you in one of Adam's films, and especially in a role that's so fascinating as this role. I have questions I want to ask you about the film and about acting in the film, but let's just start, Adam, if you can talk with us a little bit about just what the general story of the film is. I know it's very layered and textured,
sure.
But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think Luke, I saw Luke come up on his name, so I'm not sure if he's attached now. Is he there? Luke, are you there? Anyway, the story is a father and daughter story. David Thewlis plays a food inspector called Jim Davis, who spends his days going from restaurant to restaurant, targeting ethnic restaurants for the most part, doing these inspections. But we begin to realize that there is a lot of issues in his life that he's dealing with. And the film is using 5 different sort of time periods to kind of access Jim's narrative, but also the story of his daughter, Veronica. And Veronica and Jim share a particular episode that happened in their 10 years before. And they both have a very different response and position to that. And it's really fundamentally altered their relationship in a really profound way. And we're seeing the repercussions of that kind of ripple through the film. That's really what the narrative is. It's a character study of these two people, and it really starts off with Veronica going to this church to organize her father's funeral, and meeting this priest played by Luke Wilson. And the priest is confused because he has no idea why the father would have wanted to have the service in this church, because he's never been there. But we begin to realize over the course of the film that there is this embedded history. There's a reason why the father has chosen this church, and it has to do with this mysterious figure who was Veronica's music teacher, and also, without giving too much away, a figure who was very important, a love interest to her father. So there's this, it's at once a triangle, maybe it's 4 characters, and it's a story where I'm trying to understand how different people can have altering views of a piece of history that really has redefined this relationship, and whether or not there's any possibility of that being repaired, even when those characters are no longer present. Not so different from some of the other subjects I've explored, but what makes this complicated is this idea of dueling versions of the same event. And this moderator, this character played by Luke, who's trying to understand and almost take on a therapeutic role in trying to repair what the damage has been.
Many things in there to unpack.
Yeah, sorry about that. I tried to be like I was rehearsing like how to put it simply, but that's about as simple as I can get.
It will never be reduced down to that. But this is great because there's many things to talk about. But I first want to say hello to Luke.
Hi, Luke.
Hi guys. Pardon me. I've been here since the beginning, so I've heard everything. It was just a technical difficulty, so pardon me.
Okay.
Hey guys, good to see you.
Good to see you. Really great to see you.
I should ask you, Luke. Hello, first of all, since we haven't met before, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm wondering, in this film, Father Greg and Jim, the health inspector played by David, your characters never interact in the film at all, and you're 2 very central figures in the film. Did you meet on set ever?
Well, we did have one scene, but David was in a coffin, and he was deceased. But that really was a bummer for me because I was, and I'm a huge fan of David, and was so excited to do the movie. Was telling my friends like, yeah, I get to do this movie with Adam and David Thewlis. And I'm like, David, those guys are great. And I was like, well, I don't actually get to work with David, but it was great to be around him when we got to have dinner together. And yeah, that was.
It was my favorite scene.
You were so dynamic in that.
Oh, it was so relaxing. There was no stress. I didn't have to learn any lines. Atom couldn't direct me. What could he do? I was lying there. So
I did suggest I suggested where the rabbit ears might go in your hands. Sorry, there was some direction there. So
yeah, that was a little controlling. That's true, but I think that was my idea. But it was a great scene. It's also, we should stress that's not really a spoiler because you know that I'm dead from the very beginning of the film.
Yes, you do.
Even in death, us actors are cursed to be directed. So I guess that's the way it goes.
Yeah, that's awkward.
But that wasn't you had never been in a coffin before, I don't think. I remember you were, David.
I hadn't, and I quite liked it.
Right.
It was. I mean, seriously. Well, no, not seriously. I didn't like it, but I didn't find it as distressing as one might think. And indeed, the coffin closes on me, and I was then in there for about a minute or so.
And I think we can thank Luke for that, because Luke led you through that dark passage. So there you go. So maybe you did have a very important moment together.
He did. I'll never forget it, Luke. We had that moment. Hope we do something proper one day.
There's nothing like hearing cut and seeing a guy rise up out of a coffin. It still a little throws you off a little bit.
Yeah, it's given me great hope for the afterlife. It's very comfortable, very, very, very easygoing.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your casting in the film, and actually, I want to ask you, Adam, a little bit about casting in general. And I'm very interested to know, like, what are you looking for, particularly in actors when you're casting them, and then specifically with David and Luke, what were things that they brought to this? I mean, Luke in particular, it's interesting because it's written as Father Greg, and Father Greg could be anything. And Luke is an interesting idea of what Father Greg is, and he's about the same age as the actress who plays Veronica. And I'm wondering, like, what elements were you looking for in the characters, both of them, really? And
well, I mean, there was this idea that I had from when I was writing the script that everyone is from somewhere else, and that's a really important part of the fabric of the film. Not only do we see this idea of all the multi-ethnic restaurants. But Jim is an expat, and he makes a point of that when he's going into the restaurants, saying that he knows what it's like to be from somewhere else. We understand he himself had married this Brazilian woman, so Veronica is their offspring, and so there's this idea of otherness. But also, Luke is clearly from somewhere else as well. He's from Texas, and he says that at the end when he's giving his eulogy that it wasn't easy at first when he moved up here. So there's this question of I like that idea just in terms of but then it's about actors that you've seen that have given performances that were powerful and that you wanted to work with and that you got excited about, and so in all these cases, in the case of Liza de Oliveira, unfortunately she's ill and couldn't join us, but she was somebody whose work I didn't know and came in during the audition process, and I was just really, there was something about her energy and her openness and availability which was very right for that character. And in the case of Luke, I had seen him in this wonderful first feature by Reed Morano. And Luke, what's the name of it again?
Neverland.
Yeah. So I really loved that performance. I thought that was just great. I mean, of course, I'd seen Luke in comedic roles, but I thought that dramatic role was really interesting. And I thought he could be a great listener, and he is. And he has this really important moment in the film where he has to actually say something to Veronica, which is what she's been actually avoiding dealing with. This line about whether or not, because anyway, I won't get into the details. And David, of course, David is just this, ever since I saw Naked so many years ago, I wanted to work with this actor. So it's that idea of there has to be, I think look, as you know, Jeremy, you have to be excited about the performers you're working with. You have to, and that excitement is part of what we're hoping to generate and transmit to the viewer, that we're so excited to have our camera on these performances. And that's something that I've always, I relish that part of it, because these scripts are tough. I mean, these are layered scripts, and they need, performances that have a very specific tone. These are not, it's naturalist, but there's something heightened about it as well at the same time. So, everyone has to be in the same movie at some level, and it's not it purports to be kind of a realistic, but there's something heightened about it. And it's because of the place the characters are in, but the performances have to reflect that as well.
Can you both, David and Luke, talk a little bit about what attracted you to the movie and then also to your particular roles when you first read it?
David?
Well, what got it to the top of my pile of scripts was obviously Atom's name up there. I was very excited to be, asked to do it. And so I read it straight away, and I made a decision, I think, within 20 pages of reading it. I think I remember it was the pivotal point where Veronica reveals that she's in prison for something that she didn't do, but she wants to remain in prison for something she did do, and the mystery of what that is, and the unfolding of that throughout the film. And that caught my attention in terms of the narrative. And it was also, for me, I thought, a nice opportunity to do something a little more subdued than I'd been doing in recent times. I've sort of got into this groove in my career. I'm considered a character actor, but never quite sure what that means. I think all acting is character acting. But, that can lead you into some kind of broader roles sometimes. And for me, it was an opportunity to do something that was not so verbal. To create a character in silence, and that was, kind of fascinating for me. So it was something that was not as broad as some things I've been doing recently, and Atom's style and direction, pursues that this naturalistic style. Yeah, that was it really.
I just want, before coming to Luke, I just want to ask you one more question. Your performance is so mesmerizing in the film, and it's so subtle and complex and internalized in a way. But I'm wondering for you, is that a difficult challenge for you to play a character that reveals so little on the surface? There's so much buried underneath, but over time you get to know this character extremely well. But it's such a beautiful kind of layering in your performance, and the way it kind of unfolds is really quite stunning, and it culminates in this beautiful scene in the restaurant where you are kind of revealing your heart and soul for the first time in front of a group of strangers. So there's a beautiful arc that Adam's written and a beautiful arc that you've played. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the challenges or the joys of that, really.
Well, it was joys, really. It was. I don't think one would describe it as difficult. It was certainly, like I say, fascinating. And knowing, for all I say, it was a character created largely from silence, always knowing there was this substantial monologue at the end. And whenever I take any part, I usually find the biggest chunk of dialogue in there, and I learn it to make sure I think I can do it. Not that piece of dialogue, but I can do the character. So it's something I can walk around the streets and learn. So I knew I had that to reach, and it's very important that that's plausible. I think, I can't sort of create this very introverted, taciturn man and then suddenly have him pour his heart out to a room full of strangers. So it was really taking that as an end point, and I think we also shot that quite late. And of course, it was maybe not shot as out of sequence as most films. I don't think, Catherine, was it? I mean, because we had the location.
Well, I mean, with the exception of being dead at the beginning of your first day, I think you were in a funeral in the casket. But yes,
yeah. Well, it was funny actually, because I didn't meet many of the guys. Actually, Leisler and I, who plays Veronica, only worked together. You might find strange if you see the film. We only worked together for 2 days, and I'd not met her before. I met her, I think, the day before, and then we shot for 2 days, and then she had to go. And if you see the film, you feel it's a film about a father and daughter, and that we must have got to know each other very well and had lots of time to bond with each other. But in fact, we didn't. And then, like I say, didn't really get to work with Luke apart from in that coffin. And then I was really rather itinerant. I was going and working with lots of different actors in lots of different locations, in the restaurants, etc. And I never really spent too long with anybody. So it was really me and Atom I felt the big bond with, which was different to how one usually, becomes close with other actors. So I felt a little isolated, and that was no bad thing. In fact, I probably worked with the rabbit the most, and I felt more of a bond with the rabbit, and we hung out afterwards sometimes and the drink in the bar. Well, I had a drink, he had some lettuce.
It was a beautifully rendered relationship with you and the rabbit.
Yeah.
Luke, I just want to ask you, when you've done amazing comedic work and you worked with great directors like Wes Anderson, Adam Kay, and you've also done dramatic work in The Goldfinch and Meadowlands, and I'm interested, like, what drew you to this particular role, and and how important part of it was that Adam was making the film, and that you have interesting challenges as well, because almost your entire role is a two-hander with you and Veronica, which is an unusual circumstance for filmmaking. So can you want to talk about all your...
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the first thing was just the fact that it was Adam's project. And I think the first time I went to the Toronto Film Festival, The Sweet Hereafter was there. And I remembered the Russell Banks book. And that's when I'd first kind of become a fan of Adam's. So the idea that I'd get the chance to work with him was really exciting. And then just for me, growing up, the most, I would always read the Dallas Morning News, the local paper, and the most interesting section was always the Metro section, where they covered just local stories, and especially the crime. They would just have these kind of short paragraphs. And I would always just kind of wonder, okay, what's the story? There's a lot more to it than 6 or 8 sentences. There was shooting outside a bar. These were the ages of the guys. This was the street. This was the town, the time of night. And I would just always kind of wonder about those stories. And then moving out to LA a long time ago, there would start to see these, they'd have the grades for restaurants in the window of the restaurant, an A or a B, or God forbid, a C. And, me and, the guys I moved out here with would be like, okay, what are these ratings? And then I'd start to read the LA Times, and you'd read why restaurants were shut down. It was, always kind of, stuff like vermin infestation and stuff like that. So the idea that this would be a movie about kind of a health inspector, and then Lisla's character seemed just kind of really interesting to me, and tap back into that kind of, this was something that would be like a great short story by Raymond Carver or something, just kind of so interesting about these kind of jobs that you might think are mundane, but are actually, kind of, there's so much going on, and kind of how, there's so many threads to a story, to Lila's experience at the high school with the student, and Rossif Sutherland's character, and David with the different restaurants, and the idea that he's in this position of power, and he could give you a grade or shut your restaurant down if he was in a bad mood, or something like that. And it just seemed like a very interesting story. And yeah, for, like you were saying, I think maybe when people think of me, they probably think of comedies. So the idea to get to do something different, and to me, just those scenes with Lisla and myself were really interesting, almost kind of a one-act play within the movie. And yeah, some of the most kind of, for myself, some of the most interesting work that I've gotten the chance to do, the idea that you go into work and it would just be myself and another actor just kind of sitting in these chairs. And like Adam was saying earlier, it was kind of to me, like a therapist type situation. And at other times it seemed like, kind of a gentle interrogation by a detective. And at other times it was kind of, as a friend, as they got to know each other better. And it just seemed, the scenes were very thoughtful. And also just from a physical shooting standpoint, I just always like when I can just kind of look at the actor and you don't see, any other crew or any other people. And you really can just kind of focus. And Lisla had such kind of a strong but quiet presence that, yeah, I just found it to be very interesting to do. And yeah, just, it's the kind of thing that doesn't come around often. So like David, I think, yeah, it kind of sticks out from other things that might come across your desk, especially mine.
They're really beautiful scenes, the ones you have together, and they really do hold the film together in a beautiful way. And you brought up something that I think is really interesting that I wanted to ask Adam about, which is you have a line in the script where you say, that, speaking of Jim, Veronica's father, that he sounds like one of those people you hear about but never actually see. And that's such a great line. And it really typifies a lot of your interest for your main characters in a lot of your movies. Like you have characters who are insurance adjusters, or they're film censors, or, you know, you're a health inspector. And they're kind of like the ordinary Joes, but, you know, they're elevated in a certain way by your focus on them. And if you can talk a little bit about like what's that interest for you? What has that been over time?
Well, actually, that's a really interesting line to bring up, because Luke, I don't know if you remember, but that's your line. We just left the cameras rolling, and you said that line. That's not in the script.
Usually I jump to take credit, but here I forgot this line.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, and I love.
Had I known that, Jeremy, when you said that, I would have been, thank you. There's an interesting story behind that line, actually.
No, but I was really grateful, because it really meant you had tuned into all. I mean, just hearing you now talking about the film and actually being in that space, that it makes sense that you would come up with that line, but it feels very organic, and it was. I mean, what I think is interesting too is that the line that I was referring to before is that line where you say to Liza's character, when she says, why wouldn't he have told me about this? And you say, because he didn't think you'd believe him. That to me is actually a really, like, that's the whole crux of the film. That's like the whole dilemma of the film. And this question also that we had to kind of figure out, which is, at what point do you understand that you do know this relationship? You do know this young woman. You do know, you don't never get to say that. But I think I love how you register that in the film. It's very subtle to me. But look, Jeremy, I think, as you know, as a writer-director, it's just this thrill that, you're able to see these actors bring such humanity to these lines that you've written, but then also to extend them sometimes. And here was a good example where, because of the way it was shot, we could have a degree of improvisation. I don't usually use improvisation at all in my films, but in this particular case, I think, I was asking for it. If there were other things that came to mind, just let that flow. And that was one of those lines.
Well, I'm very happy to unravel the mystery of that line, where it came from. Let me ask you a little bit too about, Adam, just going back to your process and the things that draw you to writing. When this film, like most of your films, has a kind of like onion peeling, layering kind of structure. And, the story is revealed over time, like a mystery. It's very Hitchcockian in its own way, in that, you don't really know what's going on until the accretion of all these details makes the audience kind of like put it all together. So I'm wondering, like, what is the attraction of this kind of like this form of storytelling for you? Like, what does it afford you as a filmmaker?
It's just trying to access how people actually understand their own history. The fact that we don't have these things available to us emotionally all the time. And in this particular film, look, there's a trap. There's a real trap, which is that this thing happened when Veronica was 9 years old. Her mother, again, I'm assuming people who are watching this might have seen it, so I hope I'm not giving stuff away. Her mother has died of cancer. And at the same time, she suspects her father was having an affair with her music teacher. And what she doesn't understand is that her mother, who is ill, has given permission to her father to have that relationship, because the mother probably wanted to have a maternal figure that her daughter would love and would protect her daughter. So that, but there's no possible way that Jim, the father, could have told his 9-year-old that this was going on. That wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't be, it wouldn't happen. By the time it could happen, years later or at any time later, both these women are gone. And so the daughter, who would have reason to resent her father because she thinks that, that the father was having this affair with the music teacher while her mother is dying, there's no one to substantiate the father's story. And so he decides not to tell it, because he understands she doesn't trust him, and he's terrified by her response. And that's a very sad situation. It's a trap that both these characters are in. So at the very end of this movie, when we see Jim, you know, with a smile on his face in one of his inspections, I think that might be the moment where he thinks if he has his funeral, because he knows he's ill at that point, if he has his funeral, there's a chance that this priest, Luke, might be able to transmit that story and absolve him. Now, how do you tell that in a linear way? I wouldn't have the first idea. I mean, it seems to me there are so many different time periods, and there's so many things going on. So as I'm writing it, I have these 5 sort of time periods. Like I have like Veronica as a 9-year-old girl, Veronica as an adolescent, as an 18-year-old, because something very significant happens there. I won't get into that detail. another drama, another tragedy to do with the music teacher's son. Just bank that. So there's like 9-year-old, 18-year-old when she's a teacher with the band. There's when she's in jail with the father, and when she's meeting Luke. That's 5 different sort of like clear delineated periods. And then there's the period of time that David is doing these inspections, which might be over a period of months, around the time maybe when she's in jail, but also when he finds out that he's ill. So look, as a kid, I started reading, and I was reading books that were doing this all the time. You know, like it seems to be in literature, you can do that, right? You know, and then I started seeing films that were doing that. You know, the films of Alain Resnais, Hiroshima Mon Amour. There's or Muriel. You know, even more complicated. But it's the books, like you know, Nabokov's Ada, which was a huge novel for me. Like it's so challenging in terms of how it's dealing with time. And also dystopian sort of visions of reality, places that we think we're in or not, you know. So there were a lot of things that I felt early on that were available to a writer and even a filmmaker, and film, because it's, you know, as Tarkovsky says, it sculpts time. You know, it meant that you could be quite fluid in the way you were arranging scenes, and it's natural to me. You know, when people ask, is there a linear version of this story that you chop up? No. And you know, in Sweet Hereafter, I remember when the continuity breakdown came, and the continuity person said, you know that there are actually technically 15 different bus rides. And I went, that's probably true. Like if you were to break it down. So then it becomes a question of how many of those periods do you address technically, and how much of it do you just allow to flow? You know, like you don't. So that's the tricky thing. What do you attend to specifically in terms of time? So let's say the most difficult film I've made that way for a lot of people was Captive. Because Captive is dealing with 10 years, but it's all in winter, and there's no demarcations. So that becomes quite challenging as you know. But I think in a film like Exotica and Sweet Hereafter, you know, where you have a strong sense of a before and after, and the people who are orbiting around that, then it becomes easier to maybe choreograph. And in this case, I think it's pretty simple. I don't think it's confusing. I think it might, you know, at some point seem like it's knotted up, but the knots, you know, begin to reveal themselves. And the characters are, it was very, very, I found it very sad, the situation that the father and daughter are in. And I found it, you know, when people say, well, why can't they just talk about it to each other? Well, that's the problem. They can't. and the problem is that, you know, he has to elaborate this strange ritual with this priest that he barely knows, and hope that something is resolved through that.
Well, I think what's so brilliant about your films, if I can say, is that you so beautifully and intuitively, I think, interweave all these things, and it becomes a very potent way of telling your stories. And never more so than in this movie. I would love to ask you more. However, I think the audience watching has questions to ask you as well.
Sure.
So Gwen is going to come in, and she's going to take audience's questions for all 3 of you. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, to continue in that direction, we have a question from the audience for you, Tom. I really enjoyed how the past and present stories intertwined, and the order of how information was revealed. I wondered if that order evolved in the editing process, and if you discovered some interesting juxtaposition between the sections of the story.
It certainly evolves during editing, absolutely. I mean, it's there in the script, but then there are things that are shifted during the editing. There are things that you also try to recalibrate sometimes through ADR. I would say there's one thing in this film I wish I had worked into the dialogue. And I think it's a bit of a problem, and I didn't think it would be a problem until I have now watched it with audiences, Veronica may not be in prison for that long, right? The film makes it seem as though she's there for like years, and it's actually not the case. She's there for a few months, maybe. But because it's spread out over the course of the film, it actually accumulates this weight. The sentence, feels like it's much bigger than it is. So that's an example of where, in the editing, you come to understand something that you wouldn't have really realized until you began to put it together. But it's an ongoing process. And then, you're working with the music and the sound, and, that shifts tones and replaces things. But by no means does this follow the script. And I would say in a film like Sweet Hereafter, the assembly was wildly different from the final version. As a matter of fact, I could honestly say that when I saw the assembly, I went, okay, this is not working. So we had to restructure it completely. This wasn't as radical a restructuring.
What is your communication style with your creative team, and how do you connect with your actors? And thank you for your incredible contribution to the film industry.
Oh, thank you. Look, I hope that the actors will be excited to work on these things. And so it's very gratifying when I hear, David's response or Luke's response. But I've been working with great actors from the very beginning. I'm married to a great actress, Arsene Khanjian. I've been watching plays here in Toronto and being electrified by performances I've seen on stage and dreaming to work with these actors. So I think it's important that I see a performance that moves me. If it's happening on stage, that's particularly thrilling. But if it happens in a film, and in the case of both David and Luke, those were film performances that I saw. I hadn't seen either of them working on stage. So, but you need to be excited, as I said before, about working with your actors. You need to feel that what they're doing in front of that lens is so electric, because that's what's being transmitted. What was the first question? Sorry, I jumped to the second one about working with, my crew. Well, the crew, I've been working with the same crew for a very long time. So it's the same director of photography, the same editor, same composer, same sound design team. And we understand how we work. So there's a shorthand, and we need it because we're making these films in really tiny schedules. We shot this film in like 21 days. It's very ambitious. So for it to look the way it does, everything has to be very designed, and I have to be able to trust that my crew can work quickly. Because the last thing you want to do is admire someone's work and then realize that they're very slow to get those effects, because we just can't, I can't shoot that way. I've never had that luxury. So I have a couple of times, but not on this film. So this film, we were lucky with Luke that we scheduled those days. I remember, Luke, you were saying you were surprised that you had so many days to do those scenes, because you thought it was like a one day. So we had time, because those are important scenes. Those scenes are the spine of the movie. But let's say with the restaurants, we were going in and out, like many restaurants in the course of the day.
Can I jump in and just ask David and Luke about your experience, director-actor relationship? How working with Adam is different from other directors, or what's that process like for you?
David, excuse me.
Well, Luke kept leaving, I remember at the time.
Yeah, that was the problem, is that Luke kept leaving the set. And
whenever the pressure was on and it was put on the spot, he would just walk right off the set, and it was awkward. And Atom would cajole him back and make him comfortable and bring him right back to face the music, and that's his strength. A key thing, actually, which is very rare, most people not involved in the business wouldn't know this, but Atom is right there by the camera. And most directors, not to denigrate them, it's their style, but are often, by a monitor, often meters away, sometimes a mile away, whatever. And Atom is right there by the camera, almost in your eye line, but not in your eye line, because that would be very bad. So it feels like being directed, and it's no accident that Atom comes from theatre and opera, and it is right there in the room, in the actor's space. And that, for me personally, is very important, because I think sometimes you can be directed to do too much because someone is seeing it on tiny, how I can see myself now on this screen, and you can't see the subtleties happening on a face, so you end up doing something far too big. But if Atom's, seeing a real distance, it makes a world of difference, and that to me is very unusual. You see his back now.
Yeah,
back.
you know what? I think we should say that Luke, I choreographed that moment. I mean, so that's how involved, how controlling I am, is that I told Luke that when he was asked a question about acting, he would very quickly.
What you can't see at home is they're in fact in the same room.
So the viewer would think that he had an emotional response, that he was being evasive, and that there was something very troubling about what might have been happening off screen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Adam mentioned that we'd had it surprised me how much time we had to work on those scenes at the church, just with myself and Liza talking. And I don't know if it's just from the first movie I made that we were on such a tight schedule and just always on the move and trying to get shots before the sun went down, that I think ever since then I've just been kind of in a hurry at work. So it was rare to have the time, Adam would, we would have these kind of thoughtful conversations, between takes even, and definitely between setups. And I just found that, I remember thinking like, gosh, this is what it must have been like, kind of in the old days to make films where you could talk about nuance and not kind of be looking at the clock or having a producer move closer and closer to the conversation as you're trying to figure something out. And, it's like, goes back to, reading about like John Ford would wait, 3 days for the right clouds, that kind of thing. But just to have the time to talk about things and to talk about subtleties and nuance for myself, it just made me kind of slow down. And I know the first few times Adam and I would have these conversations on set, I'd kind of be saying, yeah, no, I got it. I got it. Yeah, no. And, I didn't have it. And I wasn't quite even listening. I'm just kind of, it just burned into me like, come on, got to make sure to get the day. We got to get to the next setup, just so, you know what's on a call sheet and you know what you have to get done. And I'm always kind of conscious of that. But also what David mentioned about Adam being, very close to the camera and watching you, not from a monitor across the room or in another room. And that I found really cool. I mean, my mom was a photographer, and it kind of reminded me of that, where you're kind of very just kind of in tune with the person you're working with, because sometimes, I'll find myself, looking to the cinematographer after a take, did you think, did that seem good? Or what's the expression on this person's face? Did they think it was a good dramatic scene, or are they smiling if it was supposed to be humorous? Just because they're the people there, the camera crew and, the sound people, it's oftentimes, kind of just them and you. And, you're taking direction and getting ideas from the director, but to have Adam right there, I found very kind of, kind of gives you a certain confidence that nothing's getting lost from the camera to the monitor and, that type of thing.
It's interesting because for me, it's just this thrill of like, I want to be as close to that performance. It's just a spectator, viewers, I don't understand why I would be watching behind a monitor. That's how I'll be seeing it for the rest of my life. Yeah. I mean, when I had that moment when it's live and I can be there. Now, I will say, and Jeremy, maybe we never talked about this, Jeremy, but I mean, I'm finding with the younger performers, they get very freaked out about that. Like they're not used to it. And I've had young performers say, "You're not going to be there, are you?" And it's like very odd because I go, "Well, yes, I would naturally be here," but I do think that it's a tradition that's been lost. I think. Do you agree with Jeremy? Or
it definitely, it's not something that's very common. But I also, I'm very much like you in that way. I'm very close to the camera. Sometimes I'll have like a tiny little monitor in my lap that nobody can see, but I like just refer to occasionally. But I'm always looking at the actors, and I'm always close by.
Like, why would you not want to be close to the performers? Like, it just feels like this is your only chance to be close to that physical reality of someone incarnating a role and that moment. and not have it mediated through some other instrument, right? It's already going to be mediated through the lens, and which is an amazing, alchemical, mysterious process. But to have that link to the ancient tradition of how we heard stories is really rare, and I don't know why that would be forfeited. And it's interesting, Luke, when you said that ominous thing of a producer moving closer and closer during a conversation. I mean, I've been in that situation, and it's not pretty, right? It's just like you don't want that other person to come.
It makes it, very difficult to kind of concentrate, and it certainly makes it difficult to try and, talk about kind of, things that, are very kind of complicated emotionally when, over the director's shoulder, you see these people kind of creeping closer and closer. They're obviously trying to do their job too, which I think that's the problem, is you're very aware of that. But to have the time to discuss things was great.
Talking about the sets, can you all share what was your most memorable moment on the sets?
I mean, for me, it was just very interesting to actually be at a church, and we were at a really beautiful church in Hamilton, Ontario. And so, again, it was, I found it much more rewarding than driving to a sound stage, walking onto into a cavernous building. There are all these different sets, and you just kind of go into your one little set. I mean, to be at that church kind of all day was very interesting, and definitely, walked around and kind of checked out the different rooms. But I found it very interesting to be.
Luke, I remember you saying you walked outside and you're in your priest costume, and someone came up to you, right?
People came up to me, or not people came up to me, but I found that people were very friendly, like, hello, hi. And I was like, these people in Hamilton are great. And then I look in the mirror, I'm like, I think I'm a priest. This is great. But I didn't actually have anybody try and confess anything. I'm happy.
Yeah, emergency confession.
Right.
And David, for you?
Something that stands out for me, which Atom remembers, is in the restaurant at the end where I give the big speech. So something very peculiar happened as I walked into that room, is that I realized that the carpet in this restaurant was the identical carpet I had as a child in my childhood home, which I'd never seen since, from about the age of 10. And for a film that's so much to do with childhood memory and regression and trapped memories, it was very odd, wasn't it? I got a little disturbed by that. So it's not a particular moment, but it was just something very unusual, and it was just a very particular carpet on the set that was all over this restaurant, and it threw me right back to early childhood, and was and kind of was a little spooky, and still remains so even talking about it now.
Tom, do you want to share a moment that was memorable for you on the set?
I mean, I think the most memorable moment for me was really, interestingly, it wasn't about the carpet, but it was being in that monologue and seeing David bring that to life. Because I guess it was also a moment for me where, as a much younger person, I'd seen Naked, and I'd seen those monologues that David was doing as Johnny in that role, and I thought, oh my God, wouldn't it be wonderful if one day that actor could do a monologue and something I would write. And so it was just really moving to have, and there was this one, we did the scene, and then there was something else I wanted, another energy I wanted. So I went up to David and I gave a direction, and then he immediately absorbed it. And then we got this incredible take. And it was just this sense that, oh my, it's something I said that was able to just, reorient and recalibrate what he was thinking of, and that I had the privilege of seeing that be generated and given, and like that was thrilling. That's thrilling to me. Like it's thrilling that, and I think film exists because you have this fantasy of being able to write something or think of something, and then have these performances, and that are able to take it to that next place, and pray that the camera's in the right place, that you've got the right lens on, and that everything is working technically to transmit that to a viewer. So I think that's what we get in that final scene. And, you know, I have to tell you something. And I remember I said this to David, and maybe he was disappointed because it's a 10-minute take. It's a 10-minute monologue. And when we did it, I thought, I'm not going to cut. This is so extraordinary that I'm going to keep this as a 10-minute shot. And of course, as you're editing, that becomes like outlandish, you know, that you need to know what's happening in the room. And there are certain things that you don't need to hear. Maybe it's overwritten a bit. So you are going to change it. But that was my feeling, that could be, and maybe one day as an installation in a gallery somewhere, I'll just project that, because it's an extraordinary 10-minute performance.
Well,
sorry, I was just going to say, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought the question was the most important set we'd been on. I didn't know it was the most important moment on set, so pardon me. But yeah, for me, probably the most interesting moments on set were just, I think it's related to, you know, when you're watching a movie, you kind of, I always kind of feel like you kind of know what's going to happen. And that can be kind of a soothing feeling. Even when you're reading a script, you kind of feel like you know where it's going to go. And with this movie and the scenes, I found that I would have that feeling inside where this isn't going where I think it's going to go. And those scenes with Liza, where I was kind of found myself expecting her to act a certain way for us to come to a certain conclusion or kind of solve a problem. And so when that didn't happen, I found myself kind of inwardly having to kind of get over that hump. And that's, you know, kind of course, what life is more like is things are kind of unresolved and more opaque, whereas I think we get kind of used to, you know, with watching things, kind of knowing what's going to happen. And I think that's one of the rewarding things about this movie. Yeah. You don't know what's going to happen.
And I think that goes back to what Jeremy was asking at the beginning about how to tell these stories. You know, these stories are designed so that you can't really know exactly what's going to happen. Like there's elements of melodrama for sure. There's moments of revelation, but it's not happening in any way where you would understand that this is the moment, you know. And I find that when that does happen, there's something disappointing about it. That it's great when these things feel that they're being revealed in an organic and fresh way, and that there's an immediacy. And of course, the main thing that does that is the performance. That it feels that it's real and immediate in what the performance is projecting. So you can do that structurally in terms of where the scene is and where you're deploying that bit of information, but it's really what's being registered on the face of the performer. So in that moment with like when Luke, when you're saying that line about you know because he didn't think you would believe him, I mean, I'm seeing that there's an anger there because you're impatient with her. There's something about the way she dramatizes herself that maybe you need to go to something really essential because you understand something about her and the father. And of course, in David, in your monologue, it's full of those moments. Full of those moments where you've been dying to say all of this stuff to somebody, and now you're saying it to this room of strangers, and you actually do think the way this party is organized for you, though not for the reasons that you think. So you are the guest of honor, but not for the reasons that you might think you are. So all of that is just exciting when the tone is right, when the performers understand the tone of what is needed. And they're excited, you're excited, and you're ready to go. You know, the camera's in the right place, and it's all happening.
Those words, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I would like to thank the audience for zooming in. And I'm sorry we didn't go through all the questions. They were amazing questions, a lot of them. I'd like to invite you all to watch the film on virtual cinema since the theaters are closed, and spread the word.